company. I want a dog, 'cause he would look out for me, cheer me up when I don't think I'll make it. I want a dog, 'cause he tried to lick my face, and he would smile when I get home to my place. I want a dog, 'cause sometimes humans hold it all inside. I need to feel connected. I made the wrong choice. Now I must pay the price. Trapped in my body and my own mind. I want a dog to lead me to the backyard and fetch the ball as if he was my lifeguard. I want a dog to softly walk beside me, guide me home. I wish I had a dog. We're keeping score. We are rational agents. We make our deals to try to get more famous. I made my bed, now I am gonna lie in it. That's what I get. I just wish I had a dog. I made the wrong choice. Now I must pay the price. Trapped in my body and my own mind. I made the wrong choice. Now I must pay the price. Trapped in my body and my own mind. I want a dog.
A man's best friend, a dog. Nothing like coming home to a dog that runs out to the truck and jumps up in your lap and starts licking your face. I won't say any more. All right, in this unit, we're going to talk about different measures of radiation and radioactivity. And there is a difference technically between radiation and radioactivity, which we'll get into as we talk about the different measures. Now, we've already talked about ionization energy being measured in units of electron volts. Get my tablet here so I can mark up the slide. Again, electron volts is the basic unit of measurement for ionization energy. Oftentimes we're talking about kiloelectron volts or mega electron volts. The Federal Communication Commission defines, they use electron volt measurement in their definition of ionizing radiation. According to the FCC, ionizing radiation is radiation generating at least 10 electron volts of energy, which is really low, really low. Again, and this is, for the most part, arbitrary, and it's not accepted by all agencies. This is not a regulation. It doesn't really have any impact in the working lives of a safety professional. But I just thought I'd throw that out there as another definition of ionizing radiation, or a standard for ionizing radiation. When we're measuring radiation, we're measuring radioactivity, exposure, absorbed dose, and what's called dose equivalent. And we can go beyond dose equivalent and talk about effective dose equivalent. But effective dose equivalent and dose equivalent, they use the same units. So that's really what I'm doing here, is defining these different terms, what we mean by radioactivity, and then the different measurement units. Again, this is metric, or the SI unit. This is imperial, or the US measurement unit. And U.S. measurement units, especially when we're talking about dose equivalent, are still widely used. You'll see the U.S. units referred to in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission documents and regulations and standards, and also OSHA. But most of the world has gone to the metric units. And most of the U.S. also has gone to the metric units for measuring radiation and radioactivity. But when it's dose equivalent, we still talk about REMS. And I'll talk more about that as we get there. Getting a little ahead of myself. Radioactivity, that's the energy emitted by a material. It's measured as a becquerel in the metric system, or a curie in the U.S. system of measurement. Exposure is radiation that could be absorbed by humans, measured in coulombs or Röntgens. Absorbed dose, the amount of radiation absorbed by a human, measured in grays or rads. In gray is most common. We're mostly going to focus from this point forward as far as our radiation discussion and health effects. We're going to be talking about absorbed dose and dose equivalent, those units. We don't need to worry too much about radioactivity and exposure. We don't need to worry too much about these units here from this point forward. Dose equivalence is a measure of the potential for physiological damage. How can it affect biological organisms? Again, physiological damage potential to an organism. Considers the absorbed dose, it includes the absorbed dose, which is multiplied by a quality factor based on the type of radiation exposure that occurs. Is it alpha particle radiation, which has a very high quality factor, or is it beta particle radiation, which has a much lower quality factor? But dose equivalent, physiological damage, and the unit that we're talking about is the sievert in the metric unit. And we're going to be doing some calculations, some simple calculations. We're going to calculate in sieverts, then we're going to convert the sieverts to REMs. A REM is an acronym. It stands for Röntgen Equivalent Man. And it's all based upon other units, on the Röntgen units. But the maximum allowed dose, generally speaking, in the United States for in REMs is 5 REMs annually. There are some exceptions. I'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about exposure limits. I have one slide just on exposure limits. Sievert, maximum allowed dose, 0.05. 1 sievert equals 100 rem, 0.01 sievert equals 1 rem. Some conversion factors if we need to convert back and forth between the two. So let's go ahead and talk more about the dose equivalent. Again, the absorbed dose multiplied by a quality factor. Quality factor is a value reflecting the relative impact different forms of radiation will have on a living organism. And here are some quality factors that are from your textbook. Quality factors for various types of radiation. Photon radiation, X-rays and gamma rays, quality factor of 1. Electrons or beta radiation, quality factor of 1. Alpha particles, 20. Heavy particles of unknown charge, 10. Neutrons of unknown energy, 10. And high energy protons, 10. So these quality factors, along with the amount of exposure, does determine the dose equivalent. Again, dose or absorbed dose multiplied by the quality factor equals DE, the dose equivalent. Here's an example. An X-ray technician receives a 0.02 gray dose. What is their dose equivalent? Again, here's our basic formula. DE is dose equivalent. D equals the absorbed dose. Q equals the quality factor. It's simply 0.02 times 1. Their dose equivalent is 0.02 sieverts. Now, if we want to convert sieverts to rem, we just multiply that value by 100, and the dose equivalent in rem for this x-ray technician is 2, which is 40% of the annual allowable dose. And the limit, generally speaking, for whole body exposure is 5 rem. So he's at 40% of that with this one exposure. But it's not usually, or oftentimes it's not going to be just one source of radiation. If we have multiple sources of radiation, this is how we would calculate the dose equivalent. A worker receives a 0.009 gray dose of electron radiation, or beta radiation. That should be an of. 0.009 gray dose of electron radiation. The quality factor for beta radiation is 1, and a 0.0001 gray dose from a source emitting neutron radiation of unknown energy. Quality factor equals 10. What is this worker's dose equivalent? And here's a little fancier looking formula for multiple sources. Dose equivalent multiple equals dose equivalent for the first source plus the dose equivalent for the second source, and then we would continue that out for however many different sources there were. We break down dose equivalent 1 into D1 times Q1, dose equivalent 2, D2 times Q2, so D1 times Q1 plus D2 times Q2. Plug in the values, 0.009 times the quality factor 1. Then for the DE2 variable, we have 0.001 multiplied by the quality factor of 10. Do that simple math. The dose equivalent from these multiple sources is 0.01 sieverts. Convert that to rem, 1 rem, or about 20% of the annual allowable dose. Now, one thing I should mention, usually we're talking sieverts and rem. We're usually working in microsieverts, or 1/1,000,000th of a sievert, or millirem, 1/1000th of a rem, as far as real life exposures. These exposures that I'm throwing out here to you, these are pretty high. Real life, and we'll see this here in just a second, it's going to be measuring sieverts in micro units and rem in milliunits. Now let's talk about the effective dose equivalent. This is I think the best measure when it comes to exposure. This is when radiation dosage is concentrated on one body part, as it may be. We may be exposed to radiation, but only our hands are exposed, or only other parts of our body are exposed. Everything else is shielded properly. This is radiation dosage when concentrated on one body part. For example, the thyroid is exposed while other body parts are shielded from the radiation. In this instance, to get the effective dose equivalent, we add an additional weighting factor. And here are the weighting factors from the textbook for different organs and tissues of the body. Gonads, reproductive tissues, 0.25. Breast tissue, 0.15. Thyroid, 0.03. If it's whole body exposure, then the weighting factor is 1.0. And here is the basic formula for effective dose equivalent. It's dose multiplied by the quality factor multiplied by W sub T, the weighting factor. Here's an example. A male worker is wearing a suit designed to protect them from radiation, but the jacket does not have a groin protective shield, as it should. Their testicles are exposed to a 0.03 gray dose of electron radiation. Quality factor equals 1, and a 0.01 gray dose from a source emitting high energy protons. Quality factor equals 10. What is their effective dose equivalent? And here's our formula. We've got dose equivalent source 1 plus dose equivalent source 2, all the way out for however many sources we have. We add all those up, then we multiply by the weighting factor. So in this example where we have two sources, we have dose 1 times quality factor 1 plus dose 2 multiplied by quality factor 2. Do all the work inside the brackets and multiply by the weighting factor. Plug in our values for this example. We have 0.03 gray dose of electron radiation, quality factor 1. So that's our first term there. That's D1 times Q1. Then D2 times Q2 is 0.01 gray multiplied by a quality factor of 10. Go ahead and bring all that down. Do this multiplication, we end up with 0.03. This multiplication, 0.1. Add those together, 0.13 multiplied by the weighting factor. The effective dose equivalent is 0.0325 sieverts. Convert that to rem, 3.25 rem. That guy might not be able to reproduce because that's one of the deterministic effects of radiation exposure. It makes people sterile, men and women. So a dose that's concentrated at the testicles may have some effects down the road, some consequences down the road for the person who is exposed at that level. But I mentioned this groin protective shield, jackets, smocks that are lead lined that are designed to protect from radiation. They will usually have a flap that falls down over the groin area to provide protection. All right, let's talk about exposure limits. We have exposure limits from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. That's the government agency that really deals with anything nuclear, anything radioactive. When we're talking about radiation, we're generally talking about the NRC. According to the NRC, whole body exposure can be 5 rems per year, which is equivalent to 5,000 millirems. Now, there are other limits, and I'm not going to go into all the details with the other limits. Now, if you were working in a workplace where you were exposed to radiation, you would want to make yourself very familiar with all the different exceptions to the 5 rem exception. Again, 5 rem, that's 0.05 sievert, if we recall. And I'm using the wording, the language from the NRC documents. Same thing with OSHA. OSHA has pretty much the same limits: 1.25 rem per quarter, or 5 rem per year. So the way the OSHA limits work, if a worker is exposed to 1.26 rem after, let's say, a quarter is 3 months. Let's say 2 months into the quarter, they've already been exposed to 1.25 rem. That means they should not be exposed to radiation anymore during that quarter. Their exposure allowance doesn't reset until they get to the next quarter, until that 3-month period is ended. And it's 1.25 rem per quarter or 5 rem per year. OSHA also has a total life accumulation exposure limit. How much can we be exposed to in a lifetime? And that is our total accumulation is determined by multiplying 5 by n minus 18, where n is our age. So if we were 50 years old, it's going to be 50 minus 18 times 5. And here's another example. I use someone who's 40 years old. A 40-year-old, their limit at that point in their life is going to be 110 rem. 5 times 40 minus 18, 5 times 22 equals 110 rem. Again, there are the conversion factors for rems to sieverts and sieverts to rems. To give you a better idea, let's look at some real-world exposures and how many sieverts and rem are associated with real-world exposures. Here are some reference exposures. Living within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant for 1 year. That average person living in that environment 0.09 microsieverts, or 0.000009 rem. Very low level of exposure. Going through an airport security scan, which we do when we fly. We go through the X-ray machines. 0.25 microsieverts. Average dose within 10 miles of the 3 Mile Island accident on the day of the incident. Now, the 3 Mile Island accident occurred in the late 70s in Pennsylvania. It was a nuclear power facility accident that occurred. Didn't have a core meltdown, but it was fairly serious, the most serious incident in U.S. history. If you were within 10 miles of that accident on the day of the incident, you're only going to get 80 microsieverts from that event. Another incident that occurred more recently, the Fukushima Daiichi incident in Japan, spending an hour within 2 miles, 2 months after the accident, 100 microsieverts. Now, I do have video links on that index page if you'd like to learn more. Most of you have probably studied these incidents in other classes. I know if you've taken some of my other classes, I talk in more detail about nuclear power and some of these incidents. But if you'd like to learn more, the video links are there. Now, Chernobyl, that is the worst nuclear power incident in our history. The average dose of someone evacuated from Chernobyl, which is the town adjacent to the power plant, 350,000 microsieverts, or 35 rem. That's getting pretty serious. Again, these were for the residents. And there was an explosion, a meltdown, just everything that could possibly go wrong in a nuclear power plant went wrong at Chernobyl. Worst incident ever. And that's the kind of exposures that can occur. When we have a chest x-ray, 0.01 rem. Chest x-rays, we're getting a pretty good dose with a chest x-ray. If you were doing chest x-rays every day, probably wouldn't be a good thing. Mammogram, also pretty good exposure, but it's not something we do every day. Maybe once a year, maybe every couple of years. A CT scan of the abdominal region, that's you're getting a pretty good dose with that also. 1 to 1.5 rem is what a patient would be exposed to if they were having that scan of their abdominal region. But it's not something we do every day. Most people are going to be able to have this exposure and not have any ill effects of it. Also, if we're talking about nuclear medicine, where nuclear or radioactive materials are used to treat illnesses, and if we have time, we're going to talk more about this specifically. But some very high doses are administered. Very high doses of radioactive material are administered to in efforts to fight back cancer or to get rid of the cancer in someone. So we're talking huge, above what you might see at Chernobyl exposures. And also, speaking of Chernobyl, I've also got a link to a documentary about the Chernobyl incident. It's a PBS actually it's a BBC documentary. I know there was the miniseries and all of that, which is pretty good. They did a pretty good job. They were pretty accurate in describing that incident, but I like the BBC documentary better than the, I think it was HBO had produced the miniseries on Chernobyl. But it's something that, watch them both if you're interested. Another movie that is sort of goes along with the 3 Mile Island incident. It's a movie called The China Syndrome from the 70s. If I remember correctly, the China Syndrome came out just before the 3 Mile Island incident occurred. It was eerily similar. What was depicted in the China Syndrome movie was very close to what happened with the 3 Mile Island incident in Pennsylvania in the late 70s. I mentioned that we're all exposed to background radiation. You know, we can never go near a nuclear power plant. We're being exposed to radiation. Our radiation during normal activities, our exposure during normal activities, let me give you an idea on that. Through inhalation, alpha particles that are arrive here from space and other particles that are inhaled, 228 millirem per year. Cosmic radiation, 33 millirem per year. When we fly, we have, because we're higher altitude, closer to space, we have higher exposure to cosmic radiation. On a flight from LA to London, the passenger is going to be exposed to 5 millirem of radiation. East to west coast, about 3.5 millirem. East to west coast in the United States, about 3.5 millirem. Terrestrial, from the Earth, about 21 millirem per year. Ingestion, about 29 millirem per year. I mentioned early on, I believe the first video, that when we eat a banana, we're ingesting radiation. That's called the banana dose. The banana dose, what exposure we receive from eating one banana, is 0.1 microsieverts. So how many bananas does that, I mean, if we're talking about 5 rem annual exposure, how many bananas would we have to eat to reach that 5 rem threshold? Now, we can do that. We can do the conversion here. We're going to go from 0.1 microsieverts all the way out to rem. And I'm doing an extended conversion here. You don't have to do this on the test or on the unit quiz. Now, you might need to be able to do this on certification exams. But I'm going to start with 0.1 microsievert, and I'm going to end with rems. Go through this entire conversion process, and it's 0.0001 rem or 0.01 millirem. So how many bananas for 5 rem? 50,000 bananas. Take 55,000 bananas to get to 5 rem, to get to that limit, that annual limit. So you're not going to have to worry about radiation exposure from eating or from ingesting any foods, or from terrestrial cosmic radiation or inhalation of radioactive particles. There are dangers. If you live in a home that has extensive radon exposure, then that's different. We're talking about the average normal background radiation exposure. It's not a danger. But if we live in a house that's with high levels of radiation, that's not normal activities. That's not normal background radiation. All right, I'm going to end this video here. When we come back in the next video, we're going to talk more specifically about health effects from radiation.